Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, we are taking a slow journey back to the very dawn of recorded history. Before the pyramids cast their long shadows across the sand, before the songs of Troy were ever sung, and before the world we know today even had a name. We're looking at the Sumerian tablets, those ancient pieces of clay that carry the wedges of a world 5,000 years gone. We are here to talk about the Anunnaki and what they actually say about our origins. We will discover their true purpose on Earth as we unravel one of humanity's oldest mysteries. Dim your lights now, pour a warm drink, and settle into your favorite chair. Let the quiet wrap around you like a cocoon. We are going to take our time because the truth is far more complex than any fiction. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast, silent desert. The sun is heavy on your shoulders, and the wind kicks up a fine, pale dust that gets into everything, your clothes, your hair, even your lungs. For hundreds of years, travelers and explorers move across the landscapes of what we now call Iraq and Iran, looking at strange mounds of earth that rose like blisters from the flat plains. They called these mounds tells. To a casual observer, they look like nothing more than natural hills, perhaps a bit too regular in shape, but otherwise unremarkable. But beneath that dust, beneath centuries of accumulated silt and the debris of forgotten ages, lay the remains of the very first cities. And inside those cities, buried in the darkness of collapsed palaces and scorched libraries, were hundreds of thousands of small clay objects covered in what looked like the footprints of birds. For more than 1,500 years, these marks were a total mystery. No one living knew how to read them. No one even knew what language they represented. Local people sometimes found them and thought they were magical charms, or perhaps just decorative patterns. European travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries brought a few samples back home, but the greatest minds of the time were baffled. They looked at the neat rows of tiny wedges, some pressed deep into the clay, others shallow and delicate, and they had no starting point. There was no key. There was no tradition of reading the script that had survived into the modern era. It was as if a massive curtain had been pulled across the first 3,000 years of human history, leaving us with only whispers and legends. This silence finally began to break in the middle of the 19th century. It was a time of great colonial expansion and intense scholarly competition. European powers were scrambling to fill their museums with the treasures of the ancient world. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard was digging at a site called Kuyunjik, near the modern city of Mosul. He was looking for Nineveh, the legendary capital of the Assyrian Empire mentioned in the Bible. What he found exceeded his wildest dreams. He discovered the palace of King Sennacherib, and later, the palace of Ashurbanipal. But the real treasure was not the gold or the massive stone statues of winged bulls. It was the rooms filled to the ceiling with clay tablets. This was the library of Ashurbanipal. It was a collection gathered by a king who was obsessed with knowledge, a king who had sent his scribes across the known world to copy every ancient text they could find. There were tens of thousands of them. Some were broken into 1,000,000 pieces. Others were perfectly preserved, their surfaces still crisp after 2,500 years. Layard and his team packed them into crates and shipped them back to the British Museum in London. But once they arrived, a new problem arose. They had the library of the ancient world, but they couldn't read a single word of it. It was like holding the hard drive of an ancient civilization without having the operating system to open the files. The key to unlocking this massive archive didn't come from the ruins of Nineveh, but from a sheer limestone cliff in the mountains of western Iran. This is the Behistun inscription. To understand how significant this is, you have to imagine a cliff face rising 1,700 feet above a plain. High up on that cliff, about 300 feet above the ground, A Persian king named Darius the Great had carved a massive monument to his own power. It featured a large relief of the king himself, standing over his defeated enemies. But surrounding the images were hundreds of lines of text. Darius wanted everyone to be able to read about his victories, so he had the inscription carved in 3 different languages. All 3 were written in cuneiform, but they were different types of cuneiform. One was Old Persian, which used a relatively simple version of the script. The second was Elamite, and the third was Babylonian, the complex, ancient script of the Mesopotamian heartland. This was the Rosetta Stone of the ancient Near East. If someone could decipher the Old Persian, they might be able to use it as a bridge to understand the Babylonian, and from there, the even more ancient Sumerian. The man who took on this dangerous task was a British Army officer named Henry Rawlinson. Think about the dedication this required. In the 1830s and 1840s, Rawlinson spent years traveling to this remote cliff. He had to climb up narrow ledges, sometimes dangling from ropes, just to reach the inscriptions, so he could copy the marks accurately. He was hundreds of feet above the rocky ground, often with nothing but his own grip and a bit of hemp rope between him and certain death. He used ladders. He hired a local boy to swing across a chasm to reach the most inaccessible parts of the text. He spent hours in the burning sun and the freezing wind, painstakingly tracing every wedge and every line. Rawlinson was a brilliant linguist, but even with the copies in hand, the work was grueling. He started with the Old Persian because it was the simplest. It functioned almost like an alphabet, with only about 40 different signs. By identifying the names of kings like Darius and Xerxes, which he knew from Greek histories, he was able to slowly piece together the phonetic values of the signs. It was like solving a massive 3,000-year-old crossword puzzle. Once he had the Old Persian, he turned his attention to the Babylonian section. This was much harder. The Babylonian script was a nightmare of complexity. A single sign could represent a whole word, or it could represent a sound, or it could even be a silent mark that just told you what category the next word belonged to. Some signs had multiple meanings depending on the context. It was a system designed by and for professional scribes who spent their entire lives mastering it. But Rawlinson and other scholars like Edward Hinks and Jules Oppert refused to give up. They compared the names they found in the Persian text to the corresponding spots in the Babylonian text. They looked for patterns. They built up lists of signs and their meanings. By 1857, the scholarly world was still skeptical. Many people believed these researchers were just making it up, that they were seeing patterns where none existed. To prove them wrong, the Royal Asiatic Society in London set up a fascinating experiment. They took a newly discovered cuneiform inscription from a king named Tiglath-Pileser I and sent copies of it to 4 different scholars, Rawlinson, Hinks, Oppert, and William Henry Fox Talbot. They were asked to translate the text independently, without speaking to one another, and send their results in sealed envelopes. When the envelopes were opened and the translations were read aloud, the results were stunning. All 4 scholars had produced translations that were virtually identical in their meaning. They had all identified the name of the king, his military campaigns, and his building projects. This was the definitive proof. The code had been cracked. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, the silent voices of Mesopotamia could be heard again. But as they began to read the tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, they realized they had found something even more mysterious. Many of the tablets contained lists of words. One column would be in the Babylonian language they were starting to understand, but the other column would be in a language that was completely unknown. It wasn't a Semitic language like Babylonian or Hebrew or Arabic. It was something else entirely. It was an isolate, a language that seemed to have no relatives. This was Sumerian. The scholars realized that the Babylonians and the Assyrians were not the originators of this culture. They were the inheritors of it. Thousands of years before the palaces of Nineveh were built, another people had lived in the southern marshes. They were the ones who had invented the script. They were the ones who had first written down the stories of the gods and the creation of the world. The Babylonians kept these ancient Sumerian texts much like we keep Latin or ancient Greek. They studied them, copied them, and translated them because they viewed Sumer as the source of all wisdom and civilization. As the translations progressed through the late 19th century, the world was rocked by what the tablets said. In 1872, a young researcher at the British Museum named George Smith was sorting through fragments of the Gilgamesh epic. As he cleaned the dust off one particular tablet and began to read the signs, he became so excited that he reportedly started to tear off his clothes in a state of pure shock. He had found a story that looked exactly like the account of Noah and the Great Flood, but it had been written 1,000 years before the earliest parts of the Bible. This changed everything. It meant that the stories we thought were unique to our own sacred traditions were actually part of a much older, much larger tapestry of human storytelling. It meant that the history of humanity was much longer and much more complex than anyone had imagined. And at the heart of these stories were the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. They weren't just mentioned in passing. They were the central actors in the drama of our origins. The deciphering of cuneiform was more than just a linguistic feat. It was a resurrection. It brought an entire world back from the dead. We can now read the letters of merchants complaining about the price of copper. We can read the prayers of mothers asking the gods to protect their children from fever. We can read the legal contracts, the marriage agreements, and the tax records of people who lived 5,000 years ago. But most importantly, we can read their own accounts of how the world began. When we look at these tablets today, we have to respect the medium. The Sumerians chose clay because it was abundant in the river valley, but they also chose it because it was permanent. They knew that if a city burned, the clay would only get harder. They knew that if a library collapsed, the tablets would wait in the dark. They were writing for us. They were sending a message across the gulf of time, hoping that one day someone would find the key and listen to what they had to say. Now that we have that key, we can move past the surface. We can go beyond the simple list of kings and dates. We can dive into the actual narratives that describe the Anunnaki. We can look at the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic. We can see exactly what these tablets reveal about why those beings came to Earth, what they did while they were here, and what they left behind. The first step was unlocking the script. The next step is listening to the story it tells, a story that is far more challenging and far more rewarding than any modern theory could ever be. It is the story of our first steps as a species, preserved in the very earth beneath our feet. So we find ourselves now standing in the dusty streets of ancient Babylon. Perhaps during the 11th day of the Akita festival, the great New Year celebration that marked the heartbeat of that empire. Imagine the air is thick with the smell of incense and the sound of thousands of voices murmuring in anticipation. The high priest of the temple of the Sagila, the house with the raised head, stands before the golden statue of Marduk. He is about to recite a text that we now call the Enuma Elish, a name taken from its very first words, which mean when on high. This poem was more than just a story to the people of Mesopotamia. It was the blueprint of their reality, the explanation for why the world existed as it did, and most importantly for our journey tonight, it was the primary document detailing the origin of the beings we call the Anunnaki and their decision to create humanity. As the priest begins his recitation, the words wash over the crowd like the rising waters of the Euphrates. He speaks of a time before anything had a name, before the heavens were called heaven, and the earth was called earth. In this primordial darkness, there are only two entities, Tiamat, the mother of all, representing the salt water of the chaotic sea, and Apsu, the father, representing the sweet fresh water that flows beneath the world. Their waters mingled together in a swirling, undifferentiated mass. From this union, the first generation of gods was born. These were the elder gods, beings of immense power who represented the first steps toward order in a universe of chaos. But as these younger gods grew, they became active and energetic. They danced, they laughed, they filled the silence of the primordial void with their presence. To us, this sounds like the beginning of life. But to Apsu, the father of the gods, this activity was nothing but noise. He craved the silence of the void. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to return to the quiet of non-existence. This conflict between the old silence and the new noise is the driving force of the Mesopotamian Genesis. Apsu decides to destroy his children, but he is outsmarted by the clever god Enki, who discovers a plot and strikes first, putting Apsu into a deep, magical sleep and claiming the freshwater depths as his own domain. It is in this new world that Marduk is born, a god of such radiance and power that he surpasses all who came before him. He has 4 eyes and 4 ears. Fire blazes from his lips when he speaks. He is the champion of the new order. But Tiamat, the primordial mother, is not so easily defeated. Enraged by the death of her consort Apsu, she created an army of nightmare monsters, dragons and serpents and scorpion men, to wipe out the younger gods. At the head of this army, she places Kingu, her new champion, and she gives him the Tablet of Destinies, the ultimate artifact of authority that grants whoever holds the power to determine the fate of the cosmos. The younger gods are paralyzed by fear. They have seen the monsters Tiamat has unleashed, and they know they cannot win. Only Marduk is willing to stand against her, but he demands a price. If he defeats Tiamat, he must be recognized as the supreme king of all the gods, the one whose word is absolute. The gods, desperate for survival, agree. They gather in a great hall, drinking beer and wine until they are festive and emboldened, and they grant Marduk the sovereignty of the universe. Marduk arms himself with the winds and the lightning. He rides a chariot of storms. He meets Tiamat in single combat, a battle that represents the ultimate struggle between chaos and order. He catches her in his net, drives the evil wine down her throat until she is distended and helpless, and then he pierces her heart with an arrow. With Tiamat dead, the real work of creation begins. Marduk splits her massive body in two like a shellfish. From one half, he fashions the sky, and from the other, he creates the earth. He sets the stars in their places, determines the path of the sun and the moon, and organizes the seasons. But as he looks upon his new creation, he realizes something is missing. The gods, the Anunnaki who had fought by his side, are now burdened with the task of maintaining this new world. They have to dig the irrigation canals. They have to dredge the rivers. They have to keep the cosmos running. And they are already beginning to complain. They are tired. They want to be free to feast and celebrate their victory. They want to be served, not to serve. It is here, in the 6th tablet of the Enuma Elish, that we reach the moment of our creation. Marduk conceives a plan to relieve the gods of their labor. He says, "I will solidify blood, I will form bones. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Verily, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." To do this, Marduk demands of the god who incited Tiamat to rebellion must be sacrificed. The gods point to Kingu. They bind him, sever his blood vessels, and from that divine blood mixed with the clay of the earth, the god Enki fashions the first human beings. Take a breath for a moment and let that sink in. In the Sumerian and Babylonian worldview, we were not created as the crown of creation. We were not made because a loving creator wanted children or companions. We were created as a labor force. We were the solution to a divine strike. We were the ones meant to pick up the shovels and the baskets that the gods had thrown down. This is the true purpose revealed in the tablets, a purpose of service, of maintaining the world so that the Anunnaki could exist in a state of divine leisure. The irrigation canals of Mesopotamia, the very lifeblood of their civilization, were seen as a continuation of the work originally performed by the gods themselves. Every time a Sumerian farmer cleared silt from a canal, he was fulfilling the very reason for his existence. This is where the ancient astronaut theories, popularized by writers like Zecharia Sitchin, begin to diverge from the actual text while also being strangely inspired by it. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru who came to Earth to mine gold to save our atmosphere. He suggested that they created humans through genetic engineering as a slave species to work in these mines. Now, when we look at the actual tablets, like the ones that make up the Enuma Elish or the older Atrahasis epic, we do see the theme of creation for labor. We do see the idea of humans being a substitute for divine workers. But the text doesn't talk about gold mines or space travel. It talks about agriculture. It talks about the dredging of the Tigris and the Euphrates. It talks about the building of temples and the offering of food. The scholars who have spent their lives deciphering these wedges on clay will tell you that the Mesopotamians were projecting their own social reality onto the cosmos. They lived in a world where kings ruled over a massive labor force that maintained the irrigation systems. It was only natural for them to imagine that the gods lived in a similar hierarchy. For the ancient Sumerians, the Anunnaki were the aristocracy of the universe, and we were the workers who kept the estate running. But even within this framework of service, there was a profound sense of connection, because humans were made from blood of the god. Kingu, we possess a divine spark. We were not just animals. We had intelligence, we had language, and we had the ability to understand the will of the heavens. The Enuma Elish conclude with the gods building a great city for Marduk in gratitude for freedom from labor. They call it Babylon, the gate of the gods. They establish the temples where they will receive the offerings provided by their new human servants. The poem ends with a long list of the 50 names of Marduk, each one celebrating a different aspect of his power and his role as the organizer of the universe. As the priest in that ancient temple finished his recitation, the people would have felt a sense of place. They knew who they were, where they came from, and why they were here. They were the workers of the gods, the caretakers of the earth, and the conduits through which divine order was maintained in a world that always threatened to return to the chaos of Tiamat. But there's another layer to this story, a darker and more complex narrative that we find in the Atrahasis epic, which predates the Enuma Elish. In that story, the creation of humanity leads to a problem that the gods did not anticipate. As humans multiply and go about their assigned work, they become too numerous and too noisy. The gods, who wanted humans so they could have rest and silence, now find that the noise of humanity is keeping them awake at night. This leads to a series of attempts by the god Enlil to thin the human population, first through famine, then through plague, and finally through the Great Flood. This tension between the Anunnaki and their creations is a recurring theme. We were necessary, but we were also troublesome. We provided the service the gods required, but we also brought a chaos of our own into the divine world. As we continue tonight, We will look closer at these other texts, the ones that describe the great deluge and the secrets that the god Enki hid from his fellow deities to ensure that his creation, humanity, would survive even when the king of the gods wanted us gone. We will look at how these stories of genetic and spiritual origins have been interpreted in our modern age, and what the real tablets actually tell us about the relationship between the Anunnaki and the sons and daughters of the earth. So stay comfortable. Take another sip of your drink. We are just beginning to scratch the surface of the clay. So let us turn our attention now to those beings whose name has become a lightning rod for controversy and wonder. The Anunnaki. If you have spent any time in the corners of the internet where alternative history lives, you have heard this name whispered as if it were a forbidden secret. But to the people living in the shadows of the ziggurats, the Anunnaki were not a secret. They were a fundamental reality of the universe. They were the framework upon which all of existence was hung. The word itself is a Sumerian term, and like everything in that ancient language, it carries a weight of meaning that requires a bit of unraveling. In the most literal sense, it is often translated as those of royal blood or the offspring of the sky. It comes from the roots and meaning sky or heaven and ki, meaning earth. They were the children of the union between the celestial and the terrestrial. Now, take a deep breath and try to imagine how a Sumerian scribe, sitting in the quiet of a temple library 4,000 years ago, would have understood this. To them, the Anunnaki were not biological entities from a distant star system. They were the great gods. They were the collective group of deities who decreed the fates of humanity. In the earliest texts, they are often described as a council, a divine assembly that met to decide the path of the world. Think of them as the high court of the cosmos. When a city fell, it was because the Anunnaki had decreed its destruction. When a king rose to power, it was because the Anunnaki had granted him the shepherd's crook and the crown. They were the source of order in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. In the oldest Sumerian myths, particularly those dating back to the 3rd millennium before Common Era, the Anunnaki are portrayed as the most powerful deities in the pantheon. They are often numbered as 7, the 7 who decree the fates. These 7 were the heavyweights of the divine world. Gods like Anu, the distant father of the heavens, Enlil, the lord of the air and the storm who held the keys to earthly authority, Enki, the master of wisdom and the sweet waters of the abyss, Ninhursag, the mother of all living things, and the astral deities like Inanna, Utu, and Nana. When these 7 sat in council, the very fabric of reality was being woven. They were the architects of the human experience. But as we move through time, the story of the Anunnaki begins to shift and change, revealing the complex layers of Mesopotamian thought. By the time we reach the Babylonian and Assyrian periods, the term Anunnaki begins to take on a darker, more subterranean tone. They are no longer just the gods of the high heavens. They become the judges of the underworld. In the terrifying and beautiful poem known as The Descent of Inanna, we see the Anunnaki sitting in the land of no return. They are the 7 judges who look upon the goddess with the eyes of death when she enters the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal. It is a haunting image. These divine beings, once associated with the bright vault of the sky, now presiding over the silent, dusty halls of the dead. This transition from sky gods to underworld judges tells us something profound about how the ancients viewed the cycle of life. The powers that give life and decree fate are the same powers that eventually reclaim it. There is a symmetry there, a balance that the Mesopotamians found both comforting and terrifying. But wait, you might be asking, what about the stories we hear today? What about the gold mines and the genetic engineering and the planet Nibiru? To understand where those stories come from, We have to look at how the texts were translated and, more importantly, how they have been interpreted in our modern era. One of the most persistent ideas in the ancient astronaut narrative is that the Anunnaki were a separate class of beings from another group called the Igigi. And here, the tablets do offer a fascinating kernel of truth that has been expanded into a modern myth. In the Atrahasis epic, which we'll explore in much greater detail later, there is indeed a distinction made between two groups of gods. The Anunnaki are the elite, the aristocracy of the divine realm. They are the ones who sit back and enjoy the fruits of creation. The Igigi, on the other hand, are the younger gods, the laborers, the ones who are forced to do the backbreaking work of digging the canals and dredging the rivers. Picture the scene as the tablets describe it. Before humans were ever created, the world was a building site. The Igigi were the ones with the shovels in their hands. For thousands of years, they toiled in the heat, piling up the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates. They grew weary. They grew resentful. The tablets tell us that the Igigi eventually revolted. They burned their tools and surrounded the palace of Enlil in the middle of the night. It was a labor strike of cosmic proportions. And it was this crisis, this rebellion of the lower gods against the Anunnaki elite, that led to the creation of humanity. We were made to be the replacements. We were created to take the shovels out of the hands of the Igigi and bear the yoke of labor ourselves. Now, this is a heavy thought, isn't it? Settle back for a moment and consider the implications of that story. In the Sumerian worldview, humans were not the center of the universe. We were a solution to a management problem. We were the workforce created so that the gods could have their rest. This is a far cry from the modern religious narratives of humans being created in the image of a loving creator. In the Mesopotamian mind, the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity was one of master and servant. We provided the food through our sacrifices. We provided the housing through the temples we built. In return, the Anunnaki provided the rain, the sun, and protection of the law. It was a contract, a cold, hard agreement written in the clay of our origins. But here is where the path splits between the historical record and the modern sensationalism. Scholars who spend their lives studying these tablets, people who can read the cuneiform signs as easily as you're listening to my voice, tell a very different story than the one you find on late-night television. They point out that nowhere in these thousands of tablets is there a mention of spaceships. There are no descriptions of high-tech laboratories or advanced machinery. The gods travel on boats or on the back of storm clouds. Their weapons are the bow, the mace, and the lightning bolt. To a Sumerian, these were not metaphors for technology they didn't understand. They were the literal manifestations of divine power. When we look at the Anunnaki through the eyes of the people who actually worship them, we see something much more interesting than a simple alien visitation. We see a mirror of Sumerian society itself. The Anunnaki functioned exactly like a Sumerian royal court. They had a king, a vizier, a cupbearer, and a council of elders. They fought, they cheated, they loved, and they made mistakes. By projecting their own social structures onto the heavens, the Sumerians were trying to make sense of a world that was often cruel and unpredictable. If the gods were like kings, then perhaps they could be petitioned. Perhaps they could be bribed with offerings or moved by prayers. It is easy to see why the alien interpretation is so popular. It provides a simple, physical answer to some of the most complex questions of our past. It turns the mystery of our origins into a science fiction plot. But the truth preserved on these tablets is, in many ways, much more haunting. It is the story of a people who looked up at the stars and saw not distant planets, but living, breathing powers that held their lives in the palm of their hands. They saw a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was as thin as a reed. As we spend this time together tonight, unraveling these ancient threads, I want you to think about the scribes who wrote these names down. They were not trying to hide the truth in code. They were trying to preserve the very foundation of their culture. To them, the Anunnaki were the reason for everything. The reason for the floods that destroyed their crops, and the reason for the laws that kept their cities from falling into chaos. They were the sky gods who descended to earth, but not in the way we might imagine. They descended into the lives of every man and woman in Mesopotamia, influencing every harvest, every birth, and every death. We're going to move deeper into the specific myths now. We're going to look at the actual texts where the Anunnaki appear, and see how their roles evolved from creators to judges. We will look at the Great Flood, the creation of the first man, and the secret knowledge that the god Enki was said to have whispered through a reed wall, because the real purpose of the Anunnaki on Earth, according to the tablets, was not to mine gold. It was something much more profound. It was to establish civilization itself, to give humanity the tools of measure, the structure of law, and the gift of writing. They were the ones who brought the arts of the city to the wild places of the world. So stay with me. Let the quiet of the night settle around you as we turn the next page of this ancient story. We are moving past the generalities and into the specific, recorded words of the Sumerians themselves. We are going to see what happens when the gods grow tired of their creation, and what it truly means to be a servant of the sky gods. The story is about to get much more intense, and the tablets have so much more to tell us about who we are and where we're going. We are just beginning to hear the echoes of the divine council. We are just beginning to understand the true weight of the name Anunnaki. And as we continue, you might find that the historical reality is even more staggering than the fiction we have been told. When we think of gold today, we think of wealth, of power, of something that glitters in the vaults of central banks or hangs from the necks of the elite. But in the context of the Anunnaki narrative, gold takes on a far more urgent, almost industrial character. It stops being a mere ornament and becomes a matter of planetary survival. At least, that is what the alternative history narratives would have us believe. This is perhaps the most famous and most controversial part of the entire modern Anunnaki myth. The idea that these beings did not come to Earth to be worshipped or to build a civilization for its own sake, but rather because they were desperate. They were miners on a mission, and the prize they sought was the one substance they believed could save their dying home. To understand this, we have to look at the theory popularized by Zecharia Sitchin in the late 20th century. Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki came from a planet called Nibiru, a massive celestial body with a highly elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. According to this narrative, Nibiru was facing an atmospheric crisis. Its protective shield was thinning, and heat was escaping into space, threatening the survival of all life on that distant world. The solution, Sitchin argued, was to suspend fine particles of gold into the upper atmosphere to create a reflective shield, a sort of planetary golden umbrella that would bounce heat back toward the surface and stabilize the environment. It sounds like something out of a modern science fiction blockbuster. It is a concept called geoengineering, something our own scientists are discussing today as a possible, if dangerous, solution to our own climate crisis. But Sitchin claimed the Anunnaki were doing this hundreds of thousands of years ago. He argued that because gold is non-reactive and can be beaten into incredibly thin sheets or ground into a fine dust, it was the perfect material for this atmospheric repair. But gold was scarce on Nibiru. It was, however, plentiful on a small blue planet they discovered during one of their orbital passes. Earth. This is the foundation of the atmospheric necessity theory. It paints the Anunnaki not as gods or even as conquerors, but as desperate engineers and laborers. It suggests that the entire history of humanity, from our genetic creation to the rise of our first cities, was essentially a side effect of a massive mining operation. In this view, we were not created to be the masters of our world, but the tools of another. We were the solution to a labor shortage in the gold mines of the ancient world. But when we step away from Sitchin's books and look back at the actual Sumerian tablets, the picture starts to shift. We have to ask ourselves a very difficult question. Does the word gold actually appear in the Sumerian creation myths as the reason for the gods' labor? If you look at the Atrahasis epic or the Enuma Elish, you will find descriptions of the gods working. You will read about them digging, sweating, and complaining about the heavy toll of their tasks. But as we discussed earlier, the tablets are quite specific about what they were digging. They were digging the beds of the Tigris and the Euphrates. They were clearing irrigation canals. They were dredging the waterways that made agriculture possible. The labor was agricultural and civilizational. It was about water, not gold. In the arid landscape of Mesopotamia, water was life. Without those canals, the land was a desert. With them, it was an Eden. To the ancient Sumerians, the greatest work a god could do was to provide the water that allowed the grain to grow. The idea that they were actually in deep mine shafts in southern Africa or elsewhere looking for gold, or is a modern interpretation that requires a very specific, and many would say, inaccurate reading of the original signs. Scholars of the Sumerian language have pointed out that the word Sitchin translated as gold mines or deep places often actually refer to the Abzu. In the religious context of the time, the Abzu was the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the domain of the god Enki. It was a place of mystery and wisdom, the source of all life-giving water. It was not a physical mine in the sense of a hole in the ground where ore is extracted. When the tablets speak of Enki going to the Abzu, they are describing a god returning to his watery home, not a supervisor checking on a mining colony. This creates a massive tension between the historical record and the popular alternative theory. If the tablets do not explicitly say the Anunnaki were here for gold to save their atmosphere, where did that idea come from? It seems to be a case of modern technology being projected back onto the past. We live in an age of space travel and environmental crisis. So we look at these ancient stories and try to make them fit our current anxieties. We see the mention of the gods laboring, and we think they must have been doing something high-tech. They must have been like us. But the Sumerians were not us. They had their own concerns, their own ways of seeing the world. To them, the struggle between order and chaos was not played out in the upper atmosphere with reflective gold dust. It was played out in the mud and the silt of the riverbanks. It was played out in the balance between a successful harvest and a devastating flood. Their gold was a golden grain that fed their children. When they did use physical gold, it was to honor the gods, to decorate the temples, and to signify the divine presence. In the temples of Uar and Uruk, gold was used extensively. It was used to plate the doors of the sanctuaries and to craft the statues of the deities. To the Sumerians, gold was the flesh of the gods. It was a material that did not tarnish, that did not decay, and that captured the light of the sun. It was a symbol of immortality. If the gods were seen as having a connection to gold, it was because they were eternal and unchanging, just like the metal itself. This is a very different kind of necessity than the one described by Sitchin. It is a ritual necessity, a symbolic necessity, not a technological one. However, the question of greed still lingers. Even if we discard the atmospheric shield theory, we cannot ignore how much the ancient world obsessed over this metal. From the very beginning of recorded history, Gold has been the ultimate prize. It has driven men to cross oceans and empires to go to war. Is it possible that the Anunnaki narrative, even in its most ancient form, was a way for human rulers to justify their own greed? By telling the people that the gods themselves demanded gold, that the gods themselves had once labored to extract the wealth of the earth, the kings and priests of Sumer could justify the heavy taxes and the forced labor they imposed on their own populations. Think about the power that such a story would have. If you are a common laborer in the city of Nippur, and you are told that you must spend your days digging a canal or working in a distant land to find precious metals for the temple, you might complain. But if the priest tells you that the gods themselves did this work first, that the very reason you were created was to take this burden off the shoulders of the divine, then your labor becomes a sacred duty. Your exhaustion is a form of worship. The myth of the laboring gods becomes a tool for social control. It turns the king's greed into a divine requirement. This is a gold dilemma. On one hand, we have the sensational theory of ancient astronauts and atmospheric engineering, which has captured the imagination of millions, but lacks a firm foundation in the literal translation of the texts. On the other hand, we have the historical reality of a civilization that used myth to organize labor and justify the accumulation of wealth by an elite class. One story is about extraterrestrial survival, while the other is about human power and the birth of the state. Which one is more staggering? To some, the idea of aliens in spacesuits mining gold is the ultimate mystery. But to others, the idea that 5,000 years ago, humans were already clever enough to invent complex religious narratives to coordinate the labor of tens of thousands of people is even more fascinating. It shows a level of social sophistication that is almost hard to believe. It suggests that the true purpose of the Anunnaki in the eyes of the Sumerians was to provide a framework for civilization itself, a way to understand why we work, why we serve, and why some have so much while others have so little. As we look deeper into the tablets, we find that the Anunnaki were often described as the ones who decree the fates. They were the judges. They were the ones who decided which city would rise and which would fall. Gold, in this context, was part of the tribute paid to them to ensure a favorable judgment. It was the currency of the divine court, whether they needed it for their heir or simply for their vanity. The result for humanity was the same. We became a species defined by our efforts to produce and provide for a higher power. We have to consider the possibility that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, or perhaps in a direction we have not yet fully explored. If we look at the locations mentioned in the myths, like the mysterious land of Arata, which was said to be rich in gold and lapis lazuli, we see that the Sumerians were part of a vast trade network. They were obsessed with obtaining materials they did not have in the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. Their stories reflect this constant reaching outward for wealth and resources. So, was the gold an atmospheric necessity? Probably not in the way Sitchin described. Was it a result of divine greed? Perhaps, if we see the gods as reflections of the human kings who ruled in their names. But regardless of the reason, the impact on the human story remains the same. We are the creatures who dig. We are the builders of canals and the miners of mountains. We are the ones who took the heavy yoke of the gods and made it our own. And in doing so, we built the world as we know it today. The shimmering metal that we still value so highly is a reminder of that ancient labor, a link to a past where the line between a worker, a servant, and a worshiper was almost impossible to find. As we move forward, we will see how these themes of labor and divine command led to the most dramatic event in the Anunnaki story, the decision to end it all with a great flood. For a long time, thousands of years in fact, the world was a place of divine labor. But it wasn't humans who were doing the work. According to the ancient tablets, specifically the Atrahasis epic. There was a time before the creation of mankind when the gods themselves had to toil. This is a concept that often takes people by surprise because we are so used to the idea of gods as beings of pure leisure or distant authority. But in the Sumerian worldview, the universe required maintenance. It required effort. And that effort fell upon a group of deities known as the Igigi. Think of them as a younger generation, the junior officers in the celestial hierarchy. While the Anunnaki were the great lords who sat in council and decreed the fates, the Igigi were the ones on the ground. They were the ones with the shovels and the baskets. Try to imagine the landscape of Mesopotamia during this primordial era. It was a land of raw potential, but also of immense harshness. The rivers were there, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but they were wild and unpredictable. To make the land habitable, to make it produce the abundance the gods desired, a massive infrastructure had to be built. We are talking about the digging of riverbeds and the clearing of massive irrigation channels. The tablets tell us that for 3,600 years, the Igigi bore this burden. They dug the rivers. They piled up the silt. They created the lifelines of the land. It was backbreaking, muddy, and endless work. The text describes it quite vividly, noting how they groaned under the weight of their toil. Their work was heavy, and their distress was great. This wasn't some metaphorical labor. The Sumerian scribes used very specific words for the tools of this trade. They wrote about the spade and the work basket. These were the same tools that the common laborers of Sumer used every day in the fields and on the canal banks. By attributing this same labor to the gods, the ancients were making a profound statement about the nature of the world. They believed that existence itself was a form of work, and that the order of the cosmos had to be carved out of the earth with sweat and effort. But even for gods, there is a breaking point. The Igigi were becoming resentful. They looked up at the great Anunnaki who lived in comfort and directed the work from afar, and they began to whisper among themselves. They were tired of the mud. They were tired of the baskets. They were tired of the heat. The rebellion didn't happen all at once. It was a slow burn. The tablets describe it as a grumbling in the excavations. Can you see them? A group of divine beings standing in a half-finished trench, their hands caked in clay, looking at each other with eyes full of exhaustion and growing anger. They began to gossip. They began to plan. One of them, whose name is lost to time, but whose spirit of defiance is preserved on the clay, spoke up. He told the others that their labor was killing them. He urged them to confront their supervisor, the great Lord Enlil. He suggested a strike. It is perhaps the oldest recorded labor dispute in history, occurring before history even officially began. The Igigi decided on a symbolic act of defiance. They gathered their tools, the very symbols of their servitude, and they threw them into the fire. Imagine the scene in the dead of night. The orange glow of burning wooden handles and reed baskets lighting up the faces of the rebellious gods. They watched as their shovels turned to ash, and then they began to march. They headed toward the temple of Enlil, the lord of the air and the executive of the divine council. They didn't come to talk. They came to surround his dwelling. They came to show him the face of their collective rage. Inside the temple, Enlil was asleep. He was unaware that his workforce had turned into a mob. It was Nusku, his chamberlain, who heard the commotion outside. Nusku looked out and saw the temple surrounded by the Igigi. He saw the torches. He heard the shouting. He rushed to wake his master, trembling with fear. He told Enlil that his house was besieged and that his own children and brothers were the ones at the gate. Enlil was stunned. He was the king of the earth, the one whose word was law. He couldn't believe that the junior gods would dare to challenge his authority. His first instinct was to fight, to call for his weapons and crush the rebellion. But he was also terrified. The tablets describe him as being pale with fear, his eyes clouded with tears of frustration and panic. He called for an emergency meeting of the great gods. He summoned Anu from the heavens and Enki from the depths of the freshwater ocean. When they arrived, Enlil demanded to know who had incited this revolt. He wanted the ringleader brought forward so that he could be punished. He wanted to reestablish order through force. But the Ijiji were unified. They sent word back that every single one of them had declared war. They said that their labor was too heavy and that they would not return to the trenches. They were ready to let the world fall back into chaos rather than spend another day with a basket on their shoulders. This created a massive crisis for the Anunnaki. If the Ijiji didn't work, the rivers would silt up, the crops would die, the temples would fall into disrepair. The gods would no longer receive the offerings and the comforts they had grown accustomed to. They were at a stalemate. Enlil was furious, but he was also trapped. He couldn't do the work himself, and he couldn't force the Ijiji back into the mud without risking a total war that might destroy everything. It was a moment of profound tension, a crossroads in the divine narrative. This is where Enki, the god of wisdom and the master crafts, stepped in. While Enlil was the lord of command, Enki was the lord of solutions. He listened to complaints of the Ijiji, and he acknowledged that their distress was substantial. He realized that the system was broken. The junior gods were too powerful and too important to be treated as mere pack animals. They had a point. Their labor was indeed killing them. Enki proposed a middle way. He suggested that they shouldn't punish the Ijiji, but rather they should find someone else to do the work. He proposed the creation of a new being, a creature that would be specifically designed to handle the drudgery of the earth. He turned to the birth goddess, the great mother Ninmah, and told her that she had a new task. He said that she should create a primitive worker. This creature would be called man. He would bear the yoke. He would carry the work basket. He would be the one to dig the canals and maintain the irrigation. By creating humanity, the gods could relieve the Ijiji of their burden while ensuring that the work continued. The Anunnaki would remain the lords of fate. The Ijiji would be elevated from their lowly status, and this new creature would take care of all the physical needs of the divine society. Now, this is the point where modern interpretations often take a turn into the sensational. You may have heard theories suggesting that the Ijiji were mining gold to save their home planet, and that humans were genetically engineered as slaves for this mining operation. But when we look at the actual Sumerian words on the tablets, we see a much more earthbound reality. The labor being described is not mining in deep shafts for precious metals. It is agricultural labor. It is the labor of the marshlands and the river valleys. The word for the burden they bore is shupshiku, which specifically refers to the work basket used for carrying earth during construction and canal digging. The rebellion was about mud, not gold. It is important to sit with this realization for a moment. The Sumerians weren't writing a science fiction story about extraterrestrial resource extraction. They were writing a foundational myth that explained their own reality. They lived in a world where the survival of their cities depended entirely on the constant, backbreaking maintenance of the canal systems. They knew how hard that work was because they were the ones doing it. By writing this story, they were saying that even the gods found this work to be too much. They were justifying their own place in the social order by claiming it was a divine necessity established at the dawn of time to prevent a war between the gods. When we strip away the modern layers of speculation, the story becomes even more fascinating. It reveals an ancient psychology that was deeply concerned with the balance of power and the cost of civilization. The Ijajai rebellion represents a shift in the divine bureaucracy. It shows a move from a world where gods did everything to a world where a clear hierarchy was established. The god became the managers, and humans became the labor force. This was the true purpose revealed by the tablets, a purpose rooted in the soil and water of Mesopotamia. It wasn't about a distant planet. It was about the very land the Sumerians walked upon. As we look closer at the process of this creation, we see that it wasn't a simple matter of snapping divine fingers. It required a sacrifice. To make a creature that could understand the work and possess the intelligence to carry it out, Enki said they needed to mix the clay of the earth with the blood of a god. They chose a deity named Weelu, a god who had the capacity for rationality and planning. They slaughtered him in their assembly and mixed his blood into the clay. This gave humanity a divine spark, a soul, but it was a soul bound to a body of earth and destined for a life of service. The Ijajai were free, the great god were satisfied, and the first humans stood up in the mud, ready to take the basket. It was a moment of order restored, but it was an order built on the memory of chaos and the blood of a god. The council of the gods was at a breaking point. Imagine the scene, if you will. The great hall of the Anunnaki was thick with the smell of incense and the heavy weight of an impossible decision. Enlil, the lord of the storm, paced the floor. His face was like a thundercloud ready to break. The junior gods, the Ijajai, had laid down their tools. They had burned their baskets and their spades. They were at the gates, shouting for justice, for an end to the crushing labor of digging the rivers and the canals. It was a crisis that threatened to unravel the very fabric of existence. If the workers stopped, the world would wither. The gardens of the gods would dry up. The offerings would cease. And yet, Enlil's first instinct was violence. He wanted to punish the rebels. He wanted to reassert order through force. But there was another voice in that room, a voice that was calm, deep, and filled with a wisdom that predated the foundations of the mountains. This was the voice of Enki, the prince of the freshwater deeps. Enki stood amidst the chaos and did something that only he could do. He looked past the anger and the fear. He looked toward a solution that would change the course of history forever. He didn't just see a rebellion. He saw a design flaw. The gods were working, and gods were not meant to work. They were meant to exist in a state of grace, to be served, to be honored. The Ijajai were their brothers, their kin, and they had been pushed to the brink of madness by the heavy clay and the relentless sun. Enki stepped into the center of the hall, his eyes reflecting the deep waters of the Abzu, and he raised his hand. The room fell silent. It was in this silence that the most radical proposal in the history of the world was spoken. Enki didn't suggest better tools. He didn't suggest more shifts or shorter hours. He suggested a replacement. He suggested the creation of a new kind of being, a being that had never existed before. He called it the Lulu. The word itself, Lulu, carries a strange weight in the ancient Sumerian tongue. It refers to something primitive, something raw, something yet to be refined. But Enki's vision was specific. He proposed the creation of the Lulu Amalu, the primitive worker. This was the moment where the true purpose of the Anunnaki on Earth shifted from a mission of self-sustenance to a mission of creation. Enki argued that they could create a creature that would bear the yoke, a creature that would assume the drudgery of the gods. Let the human carry the basket, he said. Let the human dig the canals. Let the human offer the grain. This was the radical spark. The idea that life could be manufactured for the specific purpose of labor. It is a concept that challenges our modern understanding of dignity and origin, but in the context of the clay tablets, it was presented as an act of cosmic mercy. Mercy for the gods who were tired, and a strange, heavy gift for the being that was about to be brought into the light. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If we follow the narrative of the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish, we are looking at a moment where humanity's existence was not an accident of nature or an act of pure, selfless love. It was a strategic decision, a solution to a labor strike. Enki was the ultimate architect, the master of the biological arts. He knew that to create something that could actually do the work of the gods, it couldn't just be an animal. It couldn't just be a beast of burden. It needed to have something more. It needed to be able to understand instructions. It needed to be able to maintain the complex systems of irrigation that the Ijiji had built. It needed to have a spark of the divine within it, or it would be useless. This is where Enki's proposal moves from a simple idea into a complex, almost scientific process. He knew that for the Lolo to function, it required a mixture, a hybridity. The gods listened to him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. How do you create life from nothing? But Enki was a master of the Abzu. He was the god of magic and wisdom. He explained that they would need the help of the Great Mother, the birth goddess known as Ninhursag or Bele Eli. He described a process that sounded to modern ears like a strange form of ancient alchemy, or perhaps, as some theorists suggest, something even more technical. He said they would need clay, the material of the earth, but they would also need the blood of a god. Not just any god, but a god who had sense, a god who had intelligence. This blood would be the catalyst. It would provide the consciousness, the ghost in the machine, that would allow the Lolo to perform its tasks. The proposal was to literally bind the essence of the Anunnaki with the dust of the ground. As we sit here tonight, exploring these ancient words, it is worth pausing to consider the sheer scale of what Enki was suggesting. He was suggesting the end of the age of the gods alone and the beginning of the age of man. He was proposing a world where the Anunnaki would become the masters and the overseers, while this new creature, the Lolo, would become the hands. The proposal wasn't met with immediate joy. There was a price. To create the Lolo, a god had to die. A life for a life. The Ijiji would be saved from their labor, but one of their own would have to be sacrificed to provide the raw material for this new race of workers. This is the darker side of the Sumerian creation story. The realization that our very existence, according to these texts, is built on the blood of a fallen deity. The dialogue recorded on the tablets between Enki and the council is incredibly revealing. He tells them to summon the birth goddess. He tells them that she is the one who will actually shape the clay. But Enki, will be the one to provide the instructions. He will be the one to oversee the mixture. There's a sense of collaboration here, a divine laboratory of sorts. They were not just creating a pet or a companion. They were creating a tool that could think. This is why the Lolo is such a significant term. It marks the transition from the purely divine to the hybrid human. It is the beginning of our story as it was written 5,000 years ago. Enki's proposal was ultimately accepted. The exhaustion of the Ijiji was so great, and the fear of Enlil's anger was so profound that the gods agreed to the sacrifice. They agreed to the experiment. Imagine the tension as Ninhursag was brought into the assembly. She was told of her task. She was told that she was to be the mother of a new race. Her reaction in the tablets is one of hesitation. She says that she cannot do it alone, that the task is too great. But Enki reassures her. He tells her that he will be with her, that he will provide the pure clay and the divine essence. This partnership between the god of wisdom and the goddess of birth is what finally sets the wheels in motion. We must look closely at the language used here. The tablets describe the Lolo as being made to bear the yoke. This phrase, to bear the yoke, appears over and over again. It is a defining characteristic of humanity. in the eyes of the early Sumerian scribes. We were the ones who stood in the gap. We were the ones who took the weight of the world off the shoulders of the Anunnaki. And in exchange, we were given life. We were given the ability to walk the earth, to build our own houses, to have our own families, as long as the work was done, as long as the gods were fed, as long as the canals flowed with water. This was the social contract of the ancient world, a contract signed in the blood of a sacrificed god and the mud of the Mesopotamian plains. It is fascinating to think about how this narrative differs from other stories of creation. In many traditions, man is created as a king or a steward. But here, in the oldest records we possess, man is created as a radical solution to a labor crisis. It is a very pragmatic, very grounded story. It doesn't shy away from the utility of our existence. And yet, there is something profoundly moving about Enki's role. He is the one who speaks up for the workers. He is the one who finds a way to stop the conflict. He is the one who sees a potential in the clay. Without Enki's radical proposal, there would be no Lulu. There would be no humanity. The gods would have destroyed each other in their civil war, or the world would have been abandoned to the silence of the desert. As we move forward into the actual act of creation, we have to keep this purpose in mind. The true purpose of the Anunnaki, as revealed in these tablets, was not just a rule, but to organize and to solve the problems of their own existence. And we, the Lulu, were their most brilliant and most complicated solution. The proposal was the beginning. The next steps would involve the actual shaping of the first humans, the 7 and 7, the males and the females, who would step out from the divine womb and begin the long, difficult task of building civilization. But it all started with a speech in a crowded hall. It all started with Enki seeing a way to marry the divine with the dust. It all started with a plan to replace the gods with something new, something called man. The weight of this proposal changed everything. It redefined what it meant to be a god, and it defined for the first time what it meant to be a human. We were the primitive ones, the Lulu, but we were also the ones who carried the spark. We were the ones who held the spade, but we were also the ones who carried the blood of the heavens in our veins. This paradox is the heart of the Sumerian tablets. It is the mystery that continues to haunt us. Why were we made? To work. But how were we made? With the very essence of the stars. It is a story of servitude, yes, but it is also a story of incredible divine connection. And it was all according to the plan of the wise prince of Eridu, the one who saw a world in need of hands and gave humanity. So, here we are, at the very heart of the mystery, the moment where the story shifts from cosmic drama between distant gods to something much more intimate, something that involves us, our origins, our nature, and that nagging feeling that has haunted humanity for thousands of years, the feeling that we are somehow more than just clever animals, that there is a spark of something else within us, something ancient, something profound, something perhaps even divine. To understand what the Sumerian tablets actually say about this, we have to look past the modern layers of science fiction and ancient astronaut theories. We have to strip away the talk of laboratories and test tubes and look at the raw, poetic, and terrifying descriptions written on the clay itself. We have to look at the ritual, the sacrifice, and the mixing of the blood in the Atrahasis epic. As we have touched on, the great gods were facing a crisis. The lesser gods, the Igigi, had burned their tools. They were standing at the gates of Enlil's palace, their voices raised in rebellion. The work of maintaining the world had become unbearable, and it was Enki, the wise prince of Eridu, who proposed a solution that was as radical as it was dangerous. He didn't just suggest making a servant. He suggested making a hybrid, a being fashioned from the clay of the earth, yes, but animated by the very essence of a god. He called upon the mother goddess, Nintu, the one who shapes the womb. He told her that she would be the one to create this new being, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed a catalyst. She needed a spark. Think about the scene for a moment. The gods are gathered in their assembly. The air is thick with tension and the smell of incense. They had decided that one of their own must die so that a new race can live. This is not the clean, sterile genetic engineering we see in movies. This is a blood sacrifice. The tablets tell us that the gods chose one among them named Geshti. In some translations, his name is written as we Ilu, but his title is what matters most. He is described as a god who is Temu. This word, Temu, is absolutely central to the story. In the ancient Akkadian language, it means more than just intelligence. It means personality. It means memory. It means a capacity for rational thought. It means the very thing that makes a conscious being who they are. They took Geshtu-E and they slaughtered him in their assembly. Imagine the gravity of that moment. A divine being, an immortal, being put to death for the sake of creation that didn't even exist yet. They took his blood, and they took his flesh, and they mixed it into the clay of the earth. The text is very specific about this mixing. It says that the god and the man would be thoroughly mixed together in the clay. Nintu, the mother goddess, stood there, her hands stained with the divine and the earthly, kneading this mixture, shaping it, preparing it. And Enki added his own touch. He commanded that the gods be cleansed by a ritual bath, and then he spat upon the clay. This wasn't an insult. In the ancient world, saliva was seen as a carrier of essence, of life force. It was a final ingredient in the recipe for humanity. But why go to such lengths? Why use the blood of a god who had Temu? The tablets give us a chilling and beautiful reason. They say that from the flesh of the god, a ghost would remain. They use the word etimo. This is the spirit, the part of us that survives death. The reason they used the blood of a god with rationality and memory was so that we, the created beings, would never forget. We would always have a ghost within us that whispered of our origins. We were designed to be workers. Yes, we were designed to dig the canals and carry the baskets. But we were also designed with a built-in memory of the divine. We were created with the ability to think, to plan, and to remember. We were given the Temu of a god so that we could perform the complex tasks required to maintain the world. Now, this is the point where modern interpretations, like those of Zecharia Sitchin, start to talk about DNA. They look at this description of mixing blood and clay, and they see an ancient account of gene splicing. They see the Anunnaki taking the genetic material of a god and injecting it into a primitive hominid, perhaps Homo erectus, to create the modern human. It is an exciting idea. It bridges the gap between ancient myth and modern science. It explains why we seem to have appeared so suddenly in the fossil record with such a massive leap in brain power and culture. But if we look at what the scribes actually wrote, the story is far more nuanced. It is not about a biological upgrade. It is about a spiritual and intellectual inheritance. The Sumerians didn't have a concept of DNA. They had a concept of blood and spirit. To them, blood was the seed of life. It was the carrier of the soul. By mixing divine blood with earthly clay, they were saying that humans are literally made of two different worlds. We are the bridge between the heavens and the earth. We have the heavy, mortal body of the clay, which will one day return to the dust. But we also have the etimo, the ghost, the spark of Geshtu-E, which gives us our consciousness and our drive. This is why we are so restless as a species. This is why we build cathedrals and rockets. This is why we write poetry and study the stars. It is a Temu, the sacrifice God within us, forever pushing against the limitations of our clay bodies. The process of our creation continued in a way that feels like a strange blend of ritual and biology. Ninta didn't just shape one person. The tablets tell us she nipped off 14 pieces of clay, 7 for the right, 7 for the left. She prepared 14 womb goddesses. These were lesser deities who would act as the first incubators. The clay mixtures were placed inside them. The tablets describe the gestation period, the waiting, the anticipation of the gods. And then, at the end of 9 months, the birth goddesses were summoned, the umbilical cords were cut, and 14 humans were born into the light of the Mesopotamian sun. 7 males, 7 females, the first generation of the new workers, the ones who would take the yoke from the shoulders of the Ijiji. You have to wonder what those first humans felt. To wake up in a world where your masters are giants who walk like men and speak with the voice of thunder. To feel the heat of the sun on your skin and the weight of the spade in your hand, but to also feel that ghost inside you, that rationality, that ability to look at the horizon and wonder what lies beyond it. The gods were delighted. Their plan had worked. The canals were being dug. The cities were being built. The offerings were beginning to flow into the temples. The heavy labor that had nearly torn the divine family apart was now being handled by this new, clever, and durable race. For a time, there was peace in the heavens. But there was a catch. There is always a catch in these ancient stories. By giving humans the blood of a god, by giving us Temu and a ghost, the Anunnaki had created something they couldn't entirely control. They wanted servants, but they had created children. They wanted mindless labor, but they had created thinkers. We were mortal, yes. Our clay would eventually crumble, but while we lived, we possessed a spark of the same fire that burned in the gods. We could communicate. We could organize. And as we began to multiply, as the 14 became hundreds, and then thousands, and then millions, our noise began to fill the earth. Our voices, fueled by the Temu of Geshti-E, became a roar that the gods could no longer ignore. This is the central tension of our existence, according to the Sumerian worldview. We are a hybrid. We are a mixture. We are divine enough to be dangerous, but earthly enough to be disposable. We are the workers who maintain the cosmos, but we are also the noise that keeps the gods awake at night. When people talk today about the Anunnaki and our genetic origins, they often focus on the idea of being slaves. But the tablets suggest something much more complex. We were an experiment in balancing the divine and the material. We were the solution to a labor crisis, but we were also the heirs to a murdered God spirit. And that ghost within us, that memory of the assembly where Geshti was slaughtered, is what drives us to seek the truth about where we came from. So, as you sit there tonight, listening to these words, think about that mixture. Think about the clay and the blood. Think about the Temu, the rationality that allows you to process these ideas, and the Edemu, the ghost that makes you feel a connection to a story that is 5,000 years old. We are not just a biological accident. We are not just a product of random evolution. At least, that is not what our ancestors believed. They believed we were a deliberate creation, a carefully crafted spark of divinity trapped in a vessel of earth. They believed we were made to work, but also made to remember. And maybe, just maybe, that memory is what we are tapping into when we look at these ancient tablets and feel a shiver of recognition. The gods may want us to bear the yoke, but they also gave us the mind to eventually ask why. And in that question, the journey of humanity truly begins. We were the spark in the dark, the result of a divine sacrifice that changed the course of the world forever. And the story of what happened once that spark began to grow into a flame is where the narrative truly starts to get complicated. Because a worker who can think is a worker who can eventually dream of freedom. And a creation that possesses the blood of its creators is a creation that will one day seek to stand among them. That is the true legacy of the genetic spark. That is the secret hidden in the mixing of the divine and the earthly. And that is why the Anunnaki were eventually forced to deal with the consequences of their own brilliance. The hands they created to work the earth were the same hands that would eventually reach for the heavens. And the story was only just beginning. From the first 14 to the billions who walk the earth today, that ghost of Geshta-E is still there, whispering in the quiet moments, reminding us that we are part of a much larger and much older story than we ever dared to imagine. Settle back now. Let that thought sink in. Because the next part of the journey is where the gods realized that their solution had created a whole new set of problems. Problems that would eventually lead to the greatest catastrophe in human history. The noise was growing. The earth was full. And the patience of Enlil was finally beginning to snap. We have explored the creation. Now we must explore the survival. And the hero who would stand between humanity and total extinction. The wise prince of Eridu was not finished with us yet. Not by a long shot. The game of the gods was moving into its most dangerous phase. And we were right in the middle of the board, holding the spade, bearing the yoke, and carrying the spirit of the stars in our veins. This is the truth revealed by the clay. This is the purpose of the Anunnaki. And this is the beginning of the end of the first age of man. Stay with me. The story is about to get much, much deeper. Let the hum of the world fade away and listen to the echoes of the assembly. The gods are speaking, and they are talking about us. They are talking about the noise. And they are talking about the end. But for now, just breathe. Remember the clay. Remember the blood. And remember the ghost that lives within you. You are part of the mystery. You are the genetic spark. And your story is far from over. It is only just finding its voice in the silence of the night. So, let us continue. Let us see what happens when the creation outgrows the creator. When the servant becomes the son, and when the gods decide that the noise has finally become too much to bear. The tablets are waiting. The ink of the ages is ready to be read, and we are just getting started. Take a sip of your drink. Get comfortable, and let us turn the next page of the Sumerian story. The story of us, the story of the Anunnaki, and the story of the true purpose of our existence on this pale blue in the vastness of the cosmos. The journey goes on, and the secrets are waiting to be unraveled, one wedge at a time, one tablet at a time, until the whole truth is laid bare under the light of the same moon that watched over the ziggurats of old. We are here, we are listening, and we are finally starting to understand. The ghost is awake, and it is time to hear what it has to say. Onward, then, to the next chapter of the mystery, to the next segment of the ancient script, to the next revelation of the Sumerian tablets. The story is calling, and we must answer, for we are the children of the clay and the blood, and our destiny is written in the stars. Let the silence wrap around you like a cocoon, and prepare for what comes next. The deluge is coming, but so is the hope, and the wise prince is watching, always watching, from the depths of the Apsu, waiting for the right moment to speak once more. And when he does, the world will never be the same again. So, let us listen together, in the quiet of the night, to the voice of the ancient ones, speaking to us across the millennia, telling us who we really are and why we are here. The genetic spark is lit, and it will never be extinguished. Not as long as there is a ghost within us to remember. Not as long as there is a story to be told. And not as long as we have the courage to listen. The tablets are open. The truth is there. And we are ready. Let the journey continue. Into the heart of the storm. And toward the light of a new understanding. This is segment 7. And the world is just beginning to wake up to the reality of our divine and earthly blood, to the truth of the genetic spark, and to the epic story of our shared human history. Rest now and prepare, for the best is yet to come. The Anunnaki are waiting, and the mystery is about to deepen even further into the dark and the light of the ancient past. The past that is also our future. The past that is always with us. In every heartbeat, in every thought, and in every breath we take. We are the legacy. We are the spark. And we are finally going home to the truth of the Sumerian tablets and the real purpose of the Anunnaki on Earth. Hey, welcome to the mystery. I am glad you are here. Let us go to the next segment, together into the unknown and the deeply familiar. The story is ours, and it is time to tell it right. At last, at long last, the silence is over, and the tablets are speaking. Can you hear them? I can, and it is a beautiful sound. The sound of truth, the sound of history, the sound of us. Segment 7 is complete, and the path is clear. Onward, to the next revelation, to the next segment, to the next step in our journey through time. I will see you there, in the light of the ancient sun, in the shadow of the ziggurat, and in the heart of the story. Until then, keep the spark alive, and never forget the ghost of the divine blood that lives within you, always and forever. See you in the next one. Tonight is just beginning, and the stars are watching, just as they always have, from the very beginning, when the clay was first mixed, and the gods first spoke our names into the silence of the world. Good night for now, but stay tuned. The truth is coming, and it is more fascinating than any fiction could ever be. I promise you that. So, let us continue into the light of the ancient past. Together, now, and forever, the story of the Anunnaki and the genetic spark of humanity is here, and it is ours to tell. At last, at last, at last. Ready? Here we go to the next segment of our shared human epic. The mystery is waiting, and so am I. Let us begin again in the quiet, in the peace, and in the truth of the clay. The tablets are speaking, and we are listening with all our hearts and all our minds and all our souls. The genetic spark is lit, and the journey continues right now, in this moment, and every moment after, until the end of time and the beginning of everything else. See you there, soon, very soon, tonight, under the stars of ancient Sumer and modern times, all joined together in one great story. The story of us, the story of the Anunnaki, the story of the genetic spark, and the divine blood mixed with the earthly clay of our home, our earth, our world, our truth. Ready? Let us go. The stories we've been told about our beginnings often center on a garden, a place of perfect peace and abundance where the first humans lived in harmony with the divine. We call it Eden. But if we look at the older records, the clay tablets from the land between the rivers, we find a word that sounds strikingly similar That word is Eden. In the Sumerian tongue, Eden simply means the plain or the steppe. It refers to the flat, fertile lands of southern Mesopotamia. But in the context of the Anunnaki, the Eden was something much more specific. It was not just a stretch of wild land. It was a restricted zone, a managed environment, a biological laboratory. If we follow the narrative of the tablets, we start to see that the Garden of Eden was the site of a massive, controlled experiment. Try to imagine the scene as it would have appeared thousands of years ago. The Anunnaki had been on Earth for a long time. They had built their cities. They had established their hierarchy. They had even created a new kind of being to do their work. The Lulu, the primitive worker. But these early versions of humanity were not just released into the wild to fend for themselves. They were prototypes. And like any prototype, they needed to be observed. They needed to be tested. The Eden was the enclosure where this observation took place. It was a place where the gods could oversee the development of their creation under perfect conditions. The tablets tell us that this region was under the direct control of Enlil. He was the commander of the Earth mission, the Lord of the Air. While Enki was the one who actually designed the humans, it was Enlil who managed the land where they were kept. This created a tension that runs through the entire story. Enki viewed the humans as his children, his masterpiece. He wanted to see them grow and thrive. Enlil, however, viewed them as tools. He wanted them to stay in their place. He wanted them to be useful, quiet, and obedient. The Eden was his way of maintaining that control. Think about the physical layout of such a place. In the ancient texts, the Eden is described as having 4 rivers flowing out of it. It was a place of advanced irrigation. The Anunnaki were masters of water management. They used the rivers to turn the dry plain into a paradise of orchards and grain fields. But this paradise was not for the humans. Not really. The humans were the ones who had to maintain it. They were placed in the Eden to tend the gardens of the gods. They were there to ensure that the Anunnaki never had to pick up a shovel again. But there was a problem with the first versions of these workers. According to the older myths, the first humans were unable to reproduce. They were created in a way that made them sterile. Much like a mule is a hybrid that cannot have offspring of its own. This meant that every time a worker died, the Anunnaki had to manufacture a new one. This was a slow and tedious process. It required the womb goddesses to undergo the labor of birth over and over. It was not efficient. It did not meet the needs of a growing civilization that required more and more labor to maintain its massive infrastructure. This is where the experiment took a turn. Enki, the master of wisdom and biology, decided that the experiment needed to evolve. He wanted the humans to be able to reproduce on their own. He wanted to give them the ability to sustain their own population. This was a massive risk. If humans could reproduce, they would become a self-sustaining species. They would no longer be entirely dependent on the gods for their existence. They would have a power that had previously been reserved for the Anunnaki alone. In the biblical story, we hear about a serpent in the garden, a being that encourages the first humans to eat from the tree of knowledge. In the Sumerian tablets, the symbol of the serpent is closely linked to Enki. His name is often associated with the sign of the snake, not as a symbol of evil, but as a symbol of secret knowledge and healing. In many ancient cultures, the serpent represented the life force, the wisdom of the deep. If we look at the double helix of DNA, it even looks like 2 serpents intertwined. It is possible that the tree of knowledge was not a physical tree at all. It might have been a metaphor for the genetic blueprints of life. When the tablets speak of Enki giving knowledge to humans in the Eden, they are talking about a biological upgrade. He was giving them the capacity for reproduction. He was giving them the knowledge of their own nature. And this, more than anything else, is what caused a great rift between the gods. Imagine the fury of Enlil when he discovered what had happened. He had wanted a controlled workforce. He had wanted a group of laborers that he could manage and monitor in his enclosed plane. Now, thanks to his brother Enki, he had a species that could grow without his permission. The experiment had moved beyond his control. The humans had become aware of themselves. They were no longer just mindless drones. They had attained a level of consciousness and biological independence that made them a threat to the established order. This is the real story behind the fall from the garden. It was not about a sin in the way we understand it today. It was a breach of protocol. It was the end of a controlled experiment. The humans were cast out of Eden not because they were bad, but because they were no longer compatible with the environment the Anunnaki had built for them. They had become too much like their creators. They had the spark of divine intelligence and the power of creation. They could no longer be kept in a cage, no matter how beautiful that cage was. When we look at the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to organized agriculture, we see a massive leap in human behavior. This leap happened in the very region where the Eden was said to be located. Suddenly, humans began to build cities. They began afar with incredible precision. They began to keep records. They began to organize their lives around the service of the gods. The tablet suggests that this was not a natural evolution. It was a taught behavior. The humans who were cast out of Eden brought the knowledge of the gods with them into the wild. They knew how to dig canals. They knew how to plant seeds. They knew how to build structures of brick and stone. They had been trained in a controlled environment of the Eden, and now they were using that training to build their own world. But they did so with a sense of loss. They remembered a time when the gods walked among them. They remembered the peace of the enclosure, and they spent the next several thousand years trying to recreate that paradise in the form of their own cities. Think about the psychological impact of this on the human race. We are a species with a fragmented memory. We have these ancient stories of a lost golden age, a time when everything was provided for us. This memory comes from the period of the experiment. We were the subjects of a biological project. We were nurtured and monitored until we became too complex to handle. Our entire history is a story of a prototype that broke free from its laboratory. The Anunnaki stayed. They watched from their temples and their palaces. They continued to guide and manipulate. But the relationship had changed. They were no longer the direct caretakers. They became the distant rulers. They became the judges. They watched as the human population exploded, just as Enlil had feared. They saw the noise and the chaos that followed, and they realized that the experiment in the Eden had succeeded in ways they never intended. What does this tell us about our true purpose? If we were created as a workforce and then upgraded to be a self-sustaining species, where does that leave us today? Are we still part of a larger experiment that is ongoing? Are the Anunnaki still observing from the shadows, waiting to see what the final result of their project will be? These are the questions that the Sumerian tablets force us to ask. They do not offer easy answers. They do not tell us that we are the center of the universe. Instead, they tell us that we are a work in progress. The Eden was just the beginning. It was the nursery of our species, the place where our DNA was shaped and our culture was born. When we look back at those ancient ruins in Iraq, we are not just looking at the remains of a dead civilization. We are looking at the site of our own origin. We are looking at the lab where the gods first tried to solve their labor problem and ended up creating a new destiny for the entire planet. Let that sink in for a moment. Every city we build, every piece of technology we create, Every system of government we establish is an echo of the training we received in that garden. We are still following the blueprints that were handed down to us by Enki and Enlil. We are still tending the world as if it were a divine orchard. We are the legacy of the Anunnaki, and the Garden of Eden is the proof that our journey was never a random accident. It was a plan, a controlled experiment that is still unfolding every single day. We must respect the past enough to see it for what it truly was. Not a fairy tale, not a myth, but a record of a complex and difficult beginning. A story of creators and creations. A story of brothers who could not agree on the fate of their newest invention. We are the children of that conflict. We are the survivors of the Eden. And as we continue to unravel the secrets of our own genetic code, we are finally starting to understand the language of the creators who sat in that ancient garden and wondered what we would become. The weight of this history is heavy. It changes the way we look at ourselves. We are not just animals that learn to think. We are a project that learned to speak. We are the dream of a God of wisdom and the nightmare of a God of order. And the world we live in today is the vast, uncontrolled extension of that small, watered plain in Sumer. The experiment continues. And we are the ones who now hold the pen, writing the next chapters of a story that started with a handful of clay and the blood of a god. We have left the garden, but the garden has never left us. It is encoded in our very being. It is the foundation of everything we have ever known. And perhaps, if we look closely enough at the ancient tablets, we can find the instructions on how to finally move beyond the experiment and become the masters of our own destiny. Hey there, welcome back. I hope you are feeling settled. Maybe take another sip of that warm drink. We are about to cross a significant threshold in our story. We have talked about the creation of humanity and the early struggle for balance between the divine and the mortal. We have explored the idea of a workforce designed to maintain the earthly estate of the gods. But now we must look at how that relationship became formalized, how it became an institutionalized structure that would define human history for thousands of years. We are moving from the era of individual creation to the era of organized civilization. The Sumerian tablets tell us that there was a specific moment when the nature of human existence changed forever. It was the moment when, as the ancient scribes put it, kingship was lowered from heaven. Think about that phrase for a second. Kingship was lowered from heaven. It implies something very specific. It suggests that the very concept of government and the complex structure of our cities was not something we stumbled upon. It was not a slow and accidental evolution of tribal elders eventually becoming kings through trial and error over thousands of years. According to the Sumerian narrative, it was a deliberate strategy. It was a formal system handed down by the Anunnaki to manage the growing human population and to organize the labor that was now the foundation of the physical world. The tablets tell us that the first place the strategy was implemented was a city called Eridu. In the Sumerian king list, which is one of the most remarkable and mysterious documents ever discovered on clay, the record begins with these exact and powerful words. When the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulin became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Now, we could spend a very long time debating those massive timelines and the spans of years that seem impossible to our modern scientific understanding. But for tonight, let us look at the location itself. Eridu. Archaeologists have actually found Eridu. It sits in the southern part of modern-day Iraq at a site called Abu Sharain. It was once right on the edge of the Persian Gulf back, when the coastline was much further inland than it is today. It was a place where the freshwater marshes met the saltwater sea. It was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom, and the deep waters. The tablets describe Eridu as the first city. the place where the blueprint for urban life was first rolled out across the dust and the silt of Mesopotamia. But why a city? Why not just let humans continue to live in small villages or wandering groups as they had for millennia? If the Anunnaki truly wanted humans to serve as a workforce, then the most efficient way to manage that workforce was through centralization. You cannot coordinate massive irrigation projects or collect significant surpluses of grain if the people are scattered across the horizon in tiny family bands. You need a hub. You need an administrative center. You need a place where the will of the gods can be interpreted and translated into daily tasks for the thousands of workers who are now filling the land. This is where we find the introduction of the me, that is spelled M-E. In Sumerian, thought the me were the divine decrees, or the fundamental laws of the universe. But they were also described almost like physical objects, blueprints, or perhaps even computer programs, if you want to use a modern analogy that contained instructions for everything a civilization needs to function. There were me for the priesthood, me for the law, me for weaving, me for music, even me for the act of kingship itself. The tablets tell us that these instructions were kept by Enki in his temple at Eridu. Imagine the scene at the very dawn of history. The flat Mesopotamian plain stretching out to the horizon, the heat shimmering off the mudflats and the reeds. And there rising out of the earth is the first ziggurat, a massive step platform of sun-dried bricks. This was the temple of Enki, but it was far more than a place of worship. It was the heart of the kingship strategy. It was a place where the administrative elite, the first priests, and the first kings received the technical instructions on how to run a city. The tablets reveal that kingship was not originally seen as a position of personal glory or inherited right. It was a functional role. The king was the Un or the Lugal. In the early days, the Un was a priest king. He was the intermediary. He was the one who stood between the Anunnaki and the human workers. His job was to ensure that the divine decrees were followed to the letter. He managed the granaries. He oversaw the digging of the canals. He settled disputes among the people so that the work would not stop. He was essentially the general manager of the earthly estate belonging to the gods. This is a very different way of looking at the birth of civilization than what we are taught in school. We often think of the first cities as the triumph of human ingenuity. We think of ourselves as finally figuring out how to live together and solve problems. But the Sumerian record suggests it was a top-down implementation. The cities were established as a way to house the human experiment in a controlled environment. The ziggurat at the center of every city was the administrative tower where the Anunnaki, or their direct representatives, could oversee the entire operation. As Eridu grew, other cities began to rise from the desert. Bad Tibra, Larik, Sippar, Shuruppak. Each of these cities was assigned to a specific Anunnaki deity. It was their city, their land, their people. The humans living there were effectively the staff and the maintenance crew of that deity's estate. This explains why the competition between these early cities was so fierce and often violent. If your god was powerful and favored, then your city prospered. If the gods fell into conflict, as the tablets often describe, then the cities they ruled would go to war. The human armies were the proxies for divine rivalries. Think about the logistical challenge of these first cities. We are talking about tens of thousands of people suddenly living in close quarters for the first time in human history. They needed water. They needed food. They needed sanitation. And above all, they needed order. The Sumerian tablets describe the meticulous detail with which these things were managed. The scribes recorded every grain of barley delivered to the temple storehouses. They recorded the birth of every sheep in the temple herds. They recorded the hours worked by every laborer. This was not a primitive society of simple farmers. This was a high-level administrative machine, and at the very top of this machine was the king who received his authority directly from heaven. The tablets make it clear that the king was not divine himself in the earliest periods. He was a human who was chosen. He was the big man who was given the symbols of authority: the crown, the throne, the scepter. These objects were said to be lowered from heaven along with the kingship. They were the tools of the office. When the king held the scepter, he was acting with the authority of the Anunnaki. He was the voice of the gods on the earth. This kingship strategy allowed for a massive scale of construction that had never been seen before. It allowed for the creation of the great canal systems that turned the parched desert into a lush garden. It allowed for the storage of enough food to survive the unpredictable floods and the long droughts of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But it also meant that humanity was now fully integrated into a system of hierarchy and control. We were no longer free roaming gatherers. We were citizens. We were subjects. We were part of the urban machine. Eridu was not just a city. It was a statement of intent. The tablets describe it as a place where the earth and the heavens first made their formal pact through the person of the king. The excavations at Eridu have revealed a sequence of temples built one on top of the other in the exact same spot. The oldest levels date back to nearly 5,000 years before the Common Era. These are simple structures, small mud brick rooms with an altar. But as the centuries pass, the temples grow. They become more complex, more imposing. By the time of the Sumerian civilization, we recognize they had become the massive ziggurats that dominated the landscape for miles. This growth in architecture mirrors the growth and the complexity of the kingship strategy itself. The tablets tell us that each city was a microcosm of the divine order. If the heavens were organized with a supreme council and various departments, then the city must be organized in the same way. The king had his vizier, his scribes, his overseers, his judges. This was the terrestrial reflection of the celestial court. When a man walked to the gates of Uruk, or Ur, he was stepping into an ordered reality that was designed to align him with the will of the Anunnaki. The Me were the key to this alignment. Imagine them as a collection of sacred protocols or operational manuals. In one famous story, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki. She gets him drunk and tricks him into giving her the Me so that she can take them back to her own city of Uruk. The list of what she takes is essentially a table of contents for civilization. She takes the Me of the high priesthood, the Me of the truth, the Me of the descent into the underworld, the Me of the art of the hero, the Me of the craft of the woodworker. This tells us that even the manual skills of humanity were considered divine gifts. They were part of the controlled rollout of knowledge. Nothing was left to chance in this new urban world. The Anunnaki, through the kingship strategy, defined how we should worship, how we should work, how we should resolve our conflicts, and even how we should think about ourselves. We were the labor force, but we were a labor force that had been given the tools of high civilization so that we could be more productive and more organized. The first cities were the factories of human progress, but the owners and designers of those factories were the beings who had lowered kingship from heaven. As you sit there tonight reflecting on this, consider how much of our modern world still follows the Sumerian template. We still live in dense cities. We still have rigid hierarchies of power. We still have specialists and bureaucrats and mountain of records. We still have laws that govern our every interaction. We are the heirs to the strategy that began in Eridu. We are the descendants of those first urban dwellers who looked up at the ziggurat and knew that their purpose was to serve the gods who had given them the city. The Sumerian king list continues through the ages. It lists the kings of Eridu, then the kings of Bad Tibra, and then the kings of other cities as the mandate moved from place to place. This suggests that the Anunnaki were constantly adjusting and refining the strategy. If one city failed or became too independent, the kingship was moved elsewhere. The power was shifted. It was a grand experiment in governance, and we are the latest iteration of that experiment. We will stop here for tonight. Let the quiet of your room surround you as you think about those first mud bricks being laid in the marshes of Eridu. Think about the first king Alulim accepting the crown that had been lowered from the sky. We are just beginning to understand the true purpose behind these cities. And in our next segment, we will see what happens when the workers in those cities began to find their own voice, and when the gods decided it might be time to start over. Thank you for staying with me on this journey through the clay and the stars. Now we come to a moment in the story that feels chillingly familiar. Yet when you look closer at the actual clay, it reveals something far more unsettling than the stories we grew up with. We have spent so much time looking at the rise of the first cities, the incredible complexity of Sumerian life, and the way these ancient people organized their world around the temples of the Anunnaki. But there's a dark shadow that hangs over this entire narrative. It is a story of a great disaster, a wiping of the slate, and a silence in the heavens that changed the relationship between humanity and the divine forever. We are talking about the Great Deluge, not just as a natural disaster, but as a deliberate, cold-blooded decision made in the highest councils of the gods. And the question we have to ask, the question that the tablets themselves grapple with, is why? Why did the gods decide to destroy what they had worked so hard to create? And more importantly, why did they choose to remain silent while their creation screamed for mercy? To understand this, we have to look back at the Atrahasis epic and the later sections of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In these texts, the world had become crowded. The cities we discussed in previous segments were thriving. Human population was exploding. But with that success came a problem that the Anunnaki had not anticipated. The tablets call it the Rigmu. The noise. They tell us that the land was bellowing like a wild bull. The people were so numerous, their activities so frantic, that the noise reached the heavens and disturbed the sleep of Enlil, the council of the gods. Now, imagine this from the perspective of an ancient Mesopotamian. You have built your cities, you have dug the canals, you have fulfilled your purpose as a servant of the gods. And yet, the very fact of your existence, the sound of your life, is considered an annoyance. Enlil becomes the antagonist of this part of the story. He is frustrated. He is tired. He cannot sleep. And so, he decides that the experiment has gone too far. He tells the assembly of the Anunnaki that the noise of mankind has become intolerable. He proposes a final solution. He wants to send a great flood to wash it all away, to return the earth to the silence that existed before the first human was fashioned from clay and divine blood. This is where the story takes a turn into a kind of psychological horror. The Anunnaki, the great gods who decree the fates, did not just agree to flood. They were forced to take a solemn oath. Enlil made them swear that they would not warn a single human soul. They were to remain absolutely silent. They were to watch in the heights of heaven as the waters rose, and they were forbidden from reaching down to save even their most faithful priests. Think about the weight of that silence. For years, the people of Sumer had brought offerings. They had sung hymns. They had looked to the ziggurats as the source of all protection. And now, the beings inside those temples were sitting in a secret council, whispering about the end of the world and promising each other that they would say nothing. This brings us to the figure of Enki. As we have seen, Enki was a clever one, the god of the fresh waters, the creator of humanity. and the one who often acted as a bridge between the divine and the mortal. He was in that room. He took that oath. He was bound by the same silence as the rest of the Anunnaki. But Enki was not willing to let his creation vanish. He could not speak to a human, but he found a way to honor the letter of his oath while breaking its spirit. In the city of Shuruppak, there lived a man named Atrahasis, which means the exceedingly wise. He was a king, a priest, and a man who was deeply attuned to the divine. He sensed that something was wrong. He felt the silence from the temples. He went to the gates of Enki's temple and sat in the dust, weeping and praying for a sign. Enki heard him, but Enki could not speak to him. So Enki spoke to the wall. He spoke to the reed wall of the hut where Atrahasis was sleeping. He said, "Wall, listen to me. Reed wall, pay attention to my words. Tear down your house. Build a boat. Abandon your possessions and save your life." It is a haunting image. The god whispering to a wall, knowing that the man on the other side is listening. It was a loophole in the divine silence. Atrahasis understood. He began to build a massive vessel, a giant cube designed to float on the rising tides. He told his neighbors that he was leaving because Enlil was angry with him, and that he was going to live with Enki in the watery depths of the Absu. He even managed to get the people of the city to help him build the boat, promising them that the gods would soon rain down abundance upon them. It is a tragic irony that the people helped build the very vessel that will be the only thing to survive their destruction. Then the storm came. The tablets describe it with a terrifying intensity that makes modern disaster movies seem pale in comparison. The storm god had roared in the clouds. The Anunnaki themselves were terrified by what they had unleashed. The goddess Ishtar, or Inanna, cried out like a woman in labor. She lamented that her children were filling the sea like the spawn of fish. The text says that the gods were cowering like dogs against the wall of heaven. They were huddled together, shivering, as the darkness swallowed the world. And here is the most fascinating part of the Sumerian account, something that is often left out of more familiar versions of the flood story. The gods were not just afraid. They were hungry. Remember, the true purpose of humanity, according to the tablets, was to provide for the gods, to grow the grain, to brew the beer, and to offer the sacrifices that sustain the divine realm. With humanity gone, there was no one to bring the food. There was no one to burn the incense. The Anunnaki were sitting in their heavenly palace, starving and thirsty, surrounded by the silence they had demanded. When the waters finally began to recede and the boat of Atrahasis came to rest on the mountains of Nimish, the first thing he did was build an altar. He offered a sacrifice. He burned cedar and myrtle. He poured out a libation. The tablets tell us that the gods smelled the sweet vapor. They gathered like flies around the sacrifice. They were so desperate for the nourishment that they forgot their anger. They were so relieved that someone had survived to feed them that they gathered around the smoke, grateful for the very beings they had tried to annihilate. Enlil arrived last, and he was furious. He saw the boat. He realized that the silence had been broken. He demanded to know which of the gods had betrayed the secret. Enki stepped forward. He did not apologize. Instead, he challenged Enlil. He said that wholesale destruction was a mistake. He said that if people sin, punish the sinner, but do not destroy the entire race. He suggested that from now on, instead of floods, the gods should use lions or wolves or famine or plague to keep the population in check. He argued for a managed humanity rather than a destroyed one. This brings us to the core of what the Sumerian tablets are trying to tell us about our relationship with the Anunnaki. It is not a story of a loving creator and a fallen people. It is a story of a difficult, often tense partnership. The gods need us, and we need them. The silence of the deluge was a moment where that partnership almost ended. It was a moment where the divine council decided that the noise of human life was not worth the service we provided. But the hunger they felt during the storm proved them wrong. They realized that without the noise, without the labor, and without the devotion of humanity, their own existence was diminished. The flood changed everything. After the waters cleared, the Anunnaki established new rules for the world. They created the mechanisms of mortality and infertility that we discussed earlier. They ensured that humanity would never again become so noisy that Enlil could not sleep. They institutionalized the distance between heaven and earth. The gods retreated further into their temples and their heavenly realms, leaving humans to manage the world through the systems of kingship and law that had been established before the waters rose. When we look at this through the lens of alternative history, we see people like Zecharia Sitchin suggesting that the flood was a natural event that the Anunnaki simply chose not to prevent because their mining operations were finished. But the tablets say something much more profound. They tell us that the flood was a choice. It was a test of the divine will and a realization of divine dependency. The gods remained silent because they were trying to convince themselves that they did not need us. They were trying to return to a state of primordial peace. But the silence was broken by the cleverness of Enki and the wisdom of Atrahasis. As you settle into your chair and listen to the rhythm of these ancient words, think about that silence. Think about the people of Sumer looking up at the ziggurats as the rain began to fall, wondering why the voices they had listened to for generations had suddenly gone quiet. The tablets do not offer an easy comfort. They offer a raw, honest look at a world where the powers that govern the universe are powerful, capricious, and deeply interconnected with our own survival. They tell us that our purpose is to be the stewards of this order, to keep the noise of life going, and to ensure that the silence of the deluge never returns. This is the true revelation of the great deluge. It is not just a story of survival. It is a story of the gods learning that their purpose on earth was tied to ours. They remained silent until they could no longer afford to be. And in that transition from the roar of the storm to the sweet smell of the first sacrifice after the flood, a new world was born. A world where humans and gods are bound together by necessity, by labor, and by the shared memory of silence that almost swallowed us all. We are the survivors of that silence, and the tablets are the record of the conversation that started again once the waters went down. So, let the weight of that history sink in. We are not just an accident of evolution or a random collection of cells. In the eyes of the ancient Sumerians, we are the reason the gods can rest and the reason they must listen. Our noise is the sound of the world continuing. Our labor is the work of the cosmos. And as long as we keep telling these stories, as long as we keep uncovering these tablets and speaking these names, we are fulfilling the contract that was rewritten on the day the rain stopped and the first bird was released into the clear, blue sky. This is why we study the past. Not just to find answers about where we came from, but to understand the responsibilities we carry into the future. The silence is over. The tablets are spoken. And the story they tell is far more incredible than any theory we could ever invent. We have traveled a long way together. We have crossed the threshold of 5,000 years, moving from the sun-drenched plains of Mesopotamia to the quiet, climate control halls of modern museums where these ancient voices now rest. We began this journey by looking at the physical reality of the Sumerian tablets, the way a simple reed stylus could press a world of meaning into wet clay. And now, in this final segment, we find ourselves looking at the legacy of those markings. We are looking at how the story of the Anunnaki, the gods who came from heaven to earth, has echoed through the centuries and how it continues to resonate in our modern world in ways that are both profound and, at times, deeply controversial. It is fascinating to consider that we are never truly finished with the past. The past is a living thing, a foundation that continues to shift and settle beneath our feet. The legacy of Sumer is not something tucked away in a dusty corner of history. It is woven into the very fabric of your daily life, often in ways you might not even realize. Think about the way you measure time. When you look at your watch or the clock on your wall and see 60 seconds in a minute or 60 minutes in an hour, you are participating in a mathematical tradition that began in the cities of Sumer. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, a base 60 system, because of its incredible flexibility. 60 can be divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It was a perfect system for people who were obsessed with order, with the cycles of the heavens, and with the practicalities of trade and administration. When you see a circle and describe it as 360 degrees, you are speaking the language of ancient Uruk and Babylon. This is a legacy that survived the collapse of empires, the burning of libraries, and the rise and fall of countless religions. It is a mathematical ghost that haunts our modern technology, a testament to the enduring power of Sumerian thought. But the legacy of the Sumerian tablets goes much deeper than the way we count. It reaches into the very core of our storytelling, our mythology, and our religious heritage. For centuries, the Western world believed that the stories in the Hebrew Bible, the tales of the creation of man and the great flood of Noah, were unique and original revelations. But when the library of Ashurbanipal was unearthed in the 19th century, and when scholars like George Smith began to translate the account of flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world was shaken. Suddenly, there was proof that these stories were part of a much older, much broader tradition. The account of the man who built a boat to survive a divinely sent deluge, who sent out birds to find dry land, and who offered sacrifices on a mountaintop, was written on clay tablets over 1,000 years before the book of Genesis took its final form. This discovery did not just provide historical context. It forced humanity to look at the interconnectedness of our sacred stories. It showed that the Sumerian understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human, the idea of gods who create and gods who destroy, had traveled across borders and through languages, shaping the spiritual landscape of the entire Near East and eventually the world. Now, we must address the modern echo that has perhaps captured the public imagination more than any other. In the late 20th century, the story of the Anunnaki took a sudden and dramatic turn. This was the era of the ancient astronaut theory, a movement that sought to reinterpreting ancient myths as historical accounts of extraterrestrial contact. The central figure in this movement, as it pertains to the Sumerian tablets, was Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin was not a trained archaeologist or professional linguist, but he spent decades studying Sumerian texts and developing a narrative that would change alternative history forever. In his book, The 12th Planet, published in 1976, he proposed a radical theory. He argued that the Anunnaki were not mythological gods, but actual flesh and blood beings from a planet called Nibiru, a celestial body on a vast elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. According to Sitchin, these beings came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago in search of gold. He claimed that they needed this gold to create a reflective shield in their own atmosphere to save their dying planet. When the lower-ranking gods, the ones the texts call the Igigi, grew tired of the backbreaking work of the mines, Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki used advanced genetic engineering to create a worker. He interpreted the Sumerian creation myths, the stories of Enki and Ninhursag mixing divine blood with clay, as a coded description of in vitro fertilization and DNA manipulation. He claimed that the Anunnaki spliced their own extraterrestrial genes with those of primitive hominids, creating Homo sapiens as a slave race to do the mining for them. This narrative was sensational. It was exciting. It offered a technological explanation for the miraculous and the divine. It turned the Sumerian tablets into a blueprint for ancient alien intervention. And for millions of people, it made sense of the gaps in the archaeological record and the strangeness of ancient mythology. It spawned countless television shows, books, and documentaries. It became a central pillar of modern alternative history. But we have to be honest and look at this legacy with a critical eye. When professional scholars, the people who have spent their lives mastering the nuances of the Sumerian language, look at Sitchin's work, they find deep and fundamental flaws. They point out that his translations often ignore the basic grammar of the ancient texts. They note that the word Anunnaki does not mean those who from heaven to earth came in a literal sense, but is a name rooted in the divine lineage of the sky god. And they show that there is no evidence in the Sumerian astronomical text for a planet called Nibiru following an orbit that matches Sitchin's description. But the power of the legacy does not always depend on its accuracy. Even if Sitchin's interpretations are rejected by academia, they have created a modern mythology that is itself a historical phenomenon. This new version of the Anunnaki has become a lens through which many people view our origins. It reflects our modern preoccupations with space travel, genetic engineering, and the fear that we might be the product of a higher, perhaps indifferent intelligence. It is a story that addresses the loneliness of being human in a vast and silent universe. It suggests that we are not alone, that we have parents in the stars, even if those parents were motivated by the need for gold. This modern echo shows just how much we still yearn for a connection to something greater than ourselves, and how we continue to look back at the oldest records of our species to find it. As we sit here in the quiet of our own time, reflecting on these ancient wedges of clay, we have to ask ourselves what the true legacy of the Anunnaki really is. Is it the sensational stories of ancient astronauts? Is it the mathematical systems that still govern our clocks? Or is it something more subtle and perhaps more important? The real legacy of the Sumerian tablets is the birth of the human voice. For the first time in our history, we didn't just tell stories. We recorded them. We captured our fears, our triumphs, our laws, and our prayers in a form that could outlast the people who wrote them. The Sumerians gave us the gift of history. They showed us that we could speak across the millennia. When we read the words of the scribe from 4,000 years ago, someone who was worried about a bad harvest or who was praising the wisdom of Enki, we are experiencing the first true bridge across time. The tablets reveal that the people of Sumer were not so different from us. They lived in complex cities. They navigated difficult bureaucracies. They worried about their children, and they tried to make sense of a world that was often unpredictable and harsh. Their gods, the Anunnaki, were a reflection of that world. Powerful, often capricious, sometimes benevolent, but always part of a grand system that required order and cooperation. The true purpose of the Anunnaki on Earth, according to the people who actually lived with them, was to provide a framework for civilization. They were the architects of the social and cosmic order. They were the ones who taught humanity how to farm, how to build, and how to live together in peace under the law. As we conclude this journey through the Sumerian tablets, take a moment to appreciate the sheer endurance of these ancient artifacts. They have survived floods and fires. They have been buried under the sands of Iraq for thousands of years, waiting for someone to find them and speak their language again. They are a reminder that our story is much older than we often realize. From the first mark made in wet clay to the digital words on your screen tonight, there's a single unbroken thread of human curiosity and a desire to be remembered. We are the descendants of those ancient scribes. We are still looking at the stars, still asking where we came from, and still trying to write down the stories that make our lives meaningful. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for walking to the temples of Eridu and the libraries of Nineveh. It has been a pleasure to unravel these mysteries with you, to look past the sensationalism and try to hear the actual voices of the people who shaped our world. The story of the Anunnaki is not just about gods or aliens. It is about us. It is about the dawn of human self-awareness and the beginning of our long, beautiful, and complicated journey through history. As you settle into the rest of your night, perhaps you will look at the moon and the stars a little differently, knowing that 5,000 years ago, someone was doing the same thing, recording their thoughts on a tablet of clay, hoping that someone, somewhere, would one day understand what they were trying to say. We have heard them. We have remembered them. And in doing so, we have honored the legacy of the stars. Good night.